So what's interesting from the perspective of someone who started writing about sovereign debt in the 1970s is what's similar and what's different. And I think what's similar is there's a fundamental problem with sovereign debt. Sovereigns by definition are sovereigns, which means they enforce their own laws within their territories. If they're not paying their creditors in other countries, there's no institution that enforces repayment. The debt contracts have to be self-enforcing. The sovereigns have to see an incentive to repay, and what those incentives are has been a regular field of study. We still don't understand very well the incentives surrounding repayment of sovereign debt. What really does it cost you not to pay? And lenders presumably are only willing to make loans if they perceive that the borrowers have incentives to repay when the debt becomes due. The difference between what happened in the 70s and 80s and now is in the 70s and 80s, the lending was mostly done by commercial banks, a fairly small number of them in a small number of rich countries. That was an innovation. We haven't really seen large-scale commercial bank lending before the 1970s. That market dried out with the defaults of the 1980s. When sovereign debt markets reemerged in the late 1990s, it wasn't with commercial bank lending, it was with bond issues, which is very much the way sovereign debt markets worked before World War II. During the Depression, there were widespread sovereign defaults that made people so pessimistic about the nature of sovereign debt that the bond markets really didn't reemerge for more than half a century. The markets now are much more complex. We have credit default swaps, which have made it much harder to understand exactly who's exposed to sovereign risk. The people who, or the creditors who hold the bonds may not be bearing the risk because they've taken a position in the market for credit default swaps that's moved the risk to someone else, which means we often have very little idea of which institutions are actually at risk. Looking forward, I think the resolution of this crisis is going to be very slow. The crisis, I think, the major part of the crisis is over. I think the intervention by the ECB stopped the crisis from leading to wholesale default. The ECB is clearly trying to protect the euro, but we're certainly not out of the woods. I think rather than suffering a lot of pain at once, we're going to be suffering more of a dull ache for a very long period of time.